Have you ever wondered what it would feel like to stand at the edge of impossible circumstances with nowhere to run and no way out? Picture this. You're trapped between a massive body of water stretching endlessly before you and the thundering hooves of an approaching army behind you. Your heart pounds as you realize there's absolutely no escape route. This is exactly where the children of Israel found themselves over 3,000 years ago in one of the most dramatic rescue missions in human history. What I'm about to share with you isn't just an ancient story gathering dust on library shelves. This is an event so monumental that it's been referenced over 120 times throughout the rest of the Bible, celebrated for 35 centuries in Passover traditions, and has inspired countless liberation movements across the globe. But here's what most people don't realize. Recent archaeological discoveries and scientific research are revealing shocking new evidence that this incredible event may have actually happened exactly as recorded. Drop a 777 in the comments if you're ready to dive deep into the most spectacular rescue operation ever documented. Because what we're about to uncover will challenge everything you thought you knew about faith, history, and the impossible becoming reality. Trust me, this journey will take you to places you never expected. The story we're exploring today picks up right where the 10 devastating plagues left off. Egypt lay in ruins. The firstborn of every Egyptian household had perished in a single night, from the palace of Pharaoh down to the humblest servants' quarters. The entire nation was in mourning, and Pharaoh, broken by grief and terror, finally released the Israelites from 4 centuries of brutal slavery. But freedom came with a twist that nobody saw coming. In Exodus chapter 13, we discover that God deliberately chose not to lead his people along the most obvious route. The coastal road through Philistine territory would have been the fastest path to the promised land, taking only about 11 days to complete. It was well-traveled, well-mapped, and well-protected. Any logical military strategist would have chosen this route. But God had something entirely different in mind. Instead, he led them through the wilderness toward the Sea of Reeds. Now here's where it gets fascinating. The Hebrew text actually says Yam Suf, which means Sea of Reeds, not Red Sea. That translation came much later from Greek scholars in the 3rd century. Recent archaeological research has identified this location as the area around modern-day Qantara, at the northern end of Bala Lake. What makes this discovery so compelling is that all 4 Hebrew place names mentioned in the biblical account have been found in ancient Egyptian hieroglyphic texts from the same region. Think about that for a moment. We're not dealing with mythical locations that can't be verified. These are real places with real names that show up in multiple ancient sources. But why did God choose this seemingly impossible route? The answer reveals something profound about divine strategy. Moses explains that God knew if the people faced war immediately, they might lose heart and return to Egypt. They needed time to transition from a slave mentality to the mindset of free people. Sometimes the longest route is actually the wisest route. As the massive crowd of Israelites journeyed through the wilderness, something extraordinary guided them. By day, a pillar of cloud moved ahead of them, providing shade from the scorching desert sun. By night, it transformed into a pillar of fire, giving them light and warmth. This wasn't just divine GPS, it was a visible manifestation of God's presence among his people. Can you imagine witnessing such a phenomenon? Picture yourself as one of those Israelites looking up to see this supernatural column moving ahead of you, knowing with absolute certainty that the creator of the universe was personally leading your journey. The psychological impact alone would have been staggering. Meanwhile, back in Egypt, something sinister was brewing. Pharaoh's initial relief at seeing the Israelites leave quickly turned into bitter regret. His advisors began whispering poison in his ears. "What have we done? We've released our entire workforce. Who's going to build our cities, harvest our crops, maintain our economy?" The economic reality of losing over 2 million workers suddenly hit home, but there was something deeper driving Pharaoh's change of heart. This wasn't just about economics, it was about pride. How could the mighty Egyptian empire, the superpower of the ancient world, be brought to its knees by a group of Hebrew slaves and their god? His reputation, his legacy, his very identity as a divine pharaoh was at stake. So Pharaoh made a decision that would seal his fate forever. He assembled his war machine, 600 of his finest chariots, plus additional chariots from throughout Egypt. These weren't ordinary vehicles. They were the ancient equivalent of tanks, each one carrying skilled warriors armed with bronze weapons and composite bows. The thundering sound of thousands of horses and wheels would have been absolutely terrifying. As this massive military force raced across the desert in pursuit, the Israelites found themselves in an increasingly desperate situation. They had followed God's guidance faithfully, but now they were trapped. Ahead of them stretched an impassable body of water. Behind them, the dust clouds on the horizon announced the approach of Pharaoh's army. This is where human logic completely breaks down. Every military manual ever written would tell you that positioning your forces with their backs to water while facing a superior enemy is strategic suicide. There's nowhere to retreat, nowhere to maneuver, nowhere to run. It's the perfect recipe for annihilation. The people began to panic, and who could blame them? They cried out to Moses with bitter sarcasm. "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, 'Leave us alone. Let us serve the Egyptians'? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert." In that moment of crisis, when fear threatened to overwhelm faith, Moses spoke words that have echoed through history. "Do not be afraid. Stand firm and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." But what happened next defied every law of nature and reason. What unfolded on the shores of that ancient sea would become the defining moment of an entire nation's identity and the foundation stone of faith for millions of people across thousands of years. The stage was set for the impossible. As Moses lifted his staff toward the churning waters, something unprecedented began to unfold. The Bible records that God sent a strong east wind that blew all night, dividing the waters and turning the seafloor into dry ground. But here's where modern science intersects with ancient miracle in ways that will absolutely blow your mind. Computer modeling studies have demonstrated that sustained winds of 60 to 70 miles per hour could theoretically push back water in shallow coastal areas, creating temporary land bridges that could last several hours. Scientists have even identified locations in the northern Red Sea region where this phenomenon could occur naturally under specific meteorological conditions. But what makes this discovery so remarkable isn't that it explains away the miracle. It's that it shows how God could have used natural forces in supernatural timing to accomplish the impossible. Picture the scene as it unfolded through the night. The pillar of cloud moved behind the Israelites, positioning itself between them and the Egyptian army. This wasn't just a strategic maneuver, it was divine intervention on multiple levels. The cloud brought darkness to the Egyptians while providing light for the Israelites. Imagine being an Egyptian soldier suddenly plunged into supernatural darkness so thick you couldn't advance, while just ahead of you, your enemies were bathed in mysterious light. Meanwhile, as the wind howled through the night, the waters began to part. Not slowly, not gradually, but with such force that walls of water rose on both sides, held back by an invisible hand. The sea floor, exposed for the first time since creation, became a highway paved by divine architecture. When morning broke, over 2 million people began the most extraordinary journey in human history. Men, women, children, elderly, livestock, an entire nation walking across the bottom of the sea between towering walls of water. The ground beneath their feet was dry, not muddy or treacherous, but firm enough to support the weight of hundreds of thousands of people and their possessions. Can you fathom the trust this required? Every step was an act of faith. Every breath was a declaration that their God was bigger than the laws of physics. Mothers carried babies across ground that should have been underwater. Children ran alongside walls of water that could have crushed them in an instant. Yet they walked in safety, protected by the same power that held back the sea. The Egyptian army, seeing their opportunity, charged into the seabed in hot pursuit. Their bronze-fitted chariots, their trained war horses, their skilled warriors, everything Egypt's military might could muster thundered across the exposed sea floor. The trap was closing, or so they thought, but divine timing is never accidental. Just as the last Israelite reached the far shore, just as the Egyptian forces found themselves in the deepest part of the seabed, God looked down upon the Egyptian army through the pillar of fire and cloud. The Bible records that he threw their forces into confusion. Chariot wheels began coming off, horses stumbled, perfectly disciplined military units descended into chaos. The Egyptian soldiers suddenly realized they weren't pursuing helpless slaves anymore. They were trapped in the middle of a supernatural event that their gods couldn't control. "Let us flee from the Israelites," they cried, "for the Lord is fighting for them against Egypt." But their recognition came too late. Moses stretched out his hand over the sea once more, and the waters that had stood like walls came crashing back with devastating force. The entire Egyptian army, every chariot, every horse, every soldier who had entered the sea was swept away. Not one of them survived. The most powerful military force in the ancient world was destroyed in minutes by the same God they had mocked and defied. Archaeological evidence continues to intrigue researchers studying this event. Submarine explorations have discovered unusual brine pools nearly 6,000 feet beneath the Gulf of Aqaba surface, containing perfectly preserved environmental records that could hold clues about ancient climate conditions. While no conclusive proof has satisfied all scholars, the accumulating evidence suggests this wasn't merely mythological storytelling. What happened next reveals the profound psychological and spiritual impact of witnessing the impossible. The Israelites, who just hours before had been crying out in terror and doubt, burst into spontaneous worship. They sang the Song of the Sea, one of the oldest pieces of Hebrew poetry ever recorded. This wasn't just celebration, it was transformation. A slave people had become a nation. A group defined by oppression had been redefined by deliverance. But perhaps the most stunning aspect of this entire account is how it established a pattern that would echo throughout history. The Exodus became the template for divine rescue, referenced over and over again by prophets, poets, and kings. Early Christians saw it as a foreshadowing of salvation through Christ. African Americans during slavery found hope in its promise of liberation. Liberation theologians across the globe have drawn inspiration from its message of divine justice. The crossing of the Red Sea wasn't just about one night of supernatural intervention. It was about establishing a new understanding of what becomes possible when human impossibility meets divine power. It demonstrated that the God who created the universe is intimately involved in human affairs, willing to bend the laws of nature to fulfill his promises to his people. This ancient account continues to challenge our modern assumptions about reality, possibility, and the nature of divine intervention in human history. So here we stand, 35 centuries later, still grappling with the magnitude of what happened on that ancient shoreline. The crossing of the Red Sea wasn't just a dramatic rescue mission. It was a defining moment that established the eternal principle that no situation is too desperate, no enemy too powerful, and no obstacle too great when divine purpose meets human faith. So, think about it. The same God who parted those waters, who held back the sea with invisible hands, who turned certain destruction into miraculous deliverance. That same power is available today. The archaeological evidence keeps mounting. The scientific research keeps revealing possibilities, but the real question isn't whether it happened. The real question is what impossible situation in your own life needs a Red Sea moment. Maybe you're standing at your own shoreline right now, trapped between overwhelming circumstances and seemingly insurmountable obstacles. Maybe you feel like those panicked Israelites, wondering if you made the wrong choices, questioning whether there's any way forward. Remember Moses' words, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today." The God of the Red Sea is still in the business of making ways where there seem to be no ways. Until next time, remember that your impossible situation might just be the setup for your greatest miracle.